Oh, it's lovely to see you all. I wasn't expecting anybody to come to this session, so absolutely anybody is genuinely amazing. I hope you all have a great time watching me stumble through my first proper talk. And with luck, I won't be the only person who leaves here having learned something. Yeah, hi, I'm Anthony. I'm a voice coordinator at the Students Union on the other side of campus. I'll talk more about the work that entails in a moment, but to summarize it, I'm currently responsible for our department representatives, who hopefully some of you will have interacted with before, the Student Representative Council that acts as our parliament, and our automation. I've got a mixed background that I think lends itself pretty well to this: software development in college, moving via undergraduate games design to humanities research as a PhD student. But I'm also not as good at this as anyone seems to think. I don't know if there are any programmers or researchers in the room, but I'm going to try and offend both groups at the same time. Half the things people think we're experts in are just getting really good at Google. That feeling when you finish a project and you get to close 53 tabs all at once and all those rabbit holes that you've forgotten you've gone down. I've only ever had that experience in two ways. One with Stack Overflow tabs and the other with Google Scholar. And if this slightly rambling introduction and the sunflower lanyard haven't clued you in yet, I have ADHD. As a result, I'm going to try and keep this session nice and casual. I've allowed time for rambling and tangents and questions as we go. And hopefully that'll mean you don't notice how disorganized the next 45 minutes are going to be. So, mind the gap, please keep hands and feet inside the carriage. Parachutes are under your seats, and I hope you've got a better idea of where the emergency exits are than I do. Let's get started. What's a cut-price apparatchik doing up here talking about automation, and why is there a session about automating administrivia at a conference about pedagogic innovation? Glad you asked, hypothetical listener. I'd be happy to tell you. I'm part of the voice team, as I mentioned, which is responsible for academic representation via course, department, school, and PGR reps, demographic representation via our representative networks, handling, investigating, navigating, and liaising with the university to solve informal student complaints, representing students in disciplinary panels, supporting and training our sabbatical officers to accomplish their manifesto goals, and maintaining and overseeing organizational governance, which is to say, with no disrespect towards the valued and essential colleagues in other departments, I worded that so many times and I could not make it less sarcastic than that we're the union part of the union. That's a huge job and we're not exactly unison. So to get all that done, we have a team of student representatives, just shy of 500 for this past academic year, not including a standby team of another couple of hundred for focus group polling from our marketing team. These volunteers need to be registered, trained, organized, supported, coordinated, and we need to be on hand for anything else that they might need as the year goes on. And all of that has to be ongoing all of the time to account for courses that start at unusual times and reps who volunteer later in the year and so on. That involves a lot of repetitive manual work, which frankly could account for a full-time job on its own. And that's just to facilitate one of the responsibilities that my team has as a whole, which is a lot of time taken away from other work, considering we had a team of 3 at the start of the year and went down to half that for the second semester. Nothing dramatic. My manager just had to take on another department, and we're now back up to full strength. Fortunately, we didn't have to deal with any of the things that could have done to our ability to support students because we already had some automation in place. Since I started learning how to use Powerautomate a year and a half ago, I've been able to improve and expand on it and bring management of those systems into our team itself instead of relying on our HR department, all of which saves us more time again. Which leads me to this session. Automating all that admin saves us an incredible amount of time and avoided a real crisis in January, and allows us to focus that time on students and the work we're here to do. And I suspect the same stands to be true for you. So if you're, hopefully you suspect that as well. So here's what you're in for. I'm going to take you on a brief guided tour of the automation we use in the voice team. I won't be showing you exactly what we use or what's currently live. We use the summer to review and revise those systems. So they're currently in pieces all over the shop floor. And our data and digital development coordinator recently added a whole bunch of automation via Power BI that I still haven't fully been able to wrap my head around. So I built a lighter version that does the same stuff without all the data integration that should hopefully only be a regular amount of intimidating. I'm also going to include a few programming principles and bits and pieces of theory along the way. Programming is very logical and people are very not. But under the hood, Powerautomate is only a few steps up from a complicated Excel formula. A little bit of programming gives me an advantage, but it's by no means necessary. The extra stuff around syntax and structure is all represented visually. And trust me when I say everyone who builds one of these things starts by Googling how someone else did it and then copying their ideas, because why reinvent the wheel? That's how most real world programming has worked for 30 years, and Turnitin isn't likely to be able to read flow anytime soon. By the end of the session, you should hopefully have a grasp of the sheer range of things Powerautomate can do. And with any luck, some of you might have some ideas for places you might want to implement it. Without further ado, welcome aboard this student's voice team trained to understanding Powerautomate, calling it issue handling, 24/7 access requests, our course rep registration and training system, and updating our network's Teams groups. Now comes the part I haven't been able to practice, which is switching between slides and Powerautomate. So please bear with us during this transition. Shall see how we go. There we are, and my mouse is slow but working. Okay, so I'm going to start off with getting rid of that. Nope. There we go. I'm going to start off with the simplest part of our suite, which is our issue handling flow. We have a Microsoft form that students can use to report issues to us and make support requests. And we use Planner to record our progress on tasks. And this flow links up by creating a Planner task based on a form entry and then sending us an email. I would try and gesture in a way that made sense, but my mouse is slightly too irresponsive for that, I'm afraid. Just to help you read what I'm showing you, a flow like this is a chain of actions which happens one at a time from top to bottom. From there, hopefully the rest of it should be fairly self-explanatory. So all we're really doing here is reading information from one place and writing it to another, but we need to split that up into smaller steps to get it into the format Powerautomate expects it in. Our first action is the trigger, which details when our flow should launch. In this case, that's whenever somebody submits a response to our form, which we identify here using the form ID, which is just part of the web address that you find that form at. If it's your form, when you make this, Powerautomate presents you with a drop-down and you can select from a list of them. But I had to build this using a form that somebody else had created for me, so I didn't have that option. Powerautomate tends to prefer drop-downs and multiple choice over expecting you to figure out which bit of code it wants in there. We then read the responses. We've got some dynamic content here where it can just reference a previous action and some of the information that that exposes to us. That sort of stuff is a godsend. And then the next action down here creates a blank task in our issue handling planner, which you can see I've been able to select it using some drop downs there. I can select from any of the SharePoint groups I'm in. So we don't have to set all of the information in here. They all have default options. We don't need to set the due date or which member of staff we want to assign it to. We do that manually afterwards. We need to apply some discretion there. And then we get to choose which colored tags we want to use with this incredibly well laid out interface of drop-down boxes with only 2 options each. But we've gone with, we use cranberry for a nice big red bold banner that says, hey, I'm a new issue that you've not dealt with yet. So we put a yes in there, everything else to no, and Bob's your uncle. There you go, it works. Because of the way Planner works, we need our task to exist before we can add details to it. So we then have to add a separate one here with a brief delay to give Planner time to do as it's told first. And then we're just filling in more information in the same way. If we pull in the task ID from the task that we created just now, which is that one there. And then we're just dropping in the answers that we got from the form. And again, we just click in the text box and sometimes it doesn't want to display. There we go. And we'll fill in the answers from our form, which scroll down, we can access there any of the things that the person who filled in our form has told us. And then all we're doing at the end, once we've pulled all our answers in, put them into our task, we send ourselves an email to let us know we've had an issue come through, because otherwise we wouldn't know about it and it'd go unhandled. Not much going on, but it saves us a few minutes in getting that task set up, and it never makes a mistake in copying that information across. It doesn't try to cut corners by summarizing anything. So that was not intentional. I don't know what I did. So not the most impactful thing in the world, but it's a helpful shortcut for us and a good place to start. Does anyone have any comments or questions on that one before I move on to the next? The next one I want to show you is from a few years ago, when we were processing a lot of requests for 24/7 access to study spaces. This is actually the first flow that the Students' Union built that interacted with anybody outside the Students' Union. It was built before I started, and we haven't used it in some years now because that's the 24/7 access requests that we're dealing with. That's now a resolved issue. But this is a much simpler version of that flow that I built for this section. The original was much more convoluted in ways it really didn't need to be. So this one, again, we're starting with forms. It copies the answers from that form into an Excel sheet, creating a unique reference number along the way, and then sends us an approval request via Teams so we can double check the details. And then once we've done that, once we've approved it, it emails the relevant people, creates a task in planner to remind us to check back later, or records the details of the rejection over here. Like I say, we start the same way as the issue handler, but this time we're using this action here to read a table that we've already defined in a pre-existing spreadsheet. I was going to have shown you the spreadsheet, but unfortunately that was an option, but it is just a spreadsheet with a table defined the same way you would any other table in Excel. No, thank you. And then we're using the action below to add a new item to the bottom of that table. We select the file and table the same way we picked out a planner earlier. I can see every SharePoint group I'm in there, every document library in the SharePoint group I select, and then I get a file browser window for that document library. And then we get once we've selected our file, we get a drop down with all the tables that we've defined in that spreadsheet. And at that point, Flow automatically fills in all of the columns in that table down the rest of the action for us. And gives a neat box to plug our form answers into. That's what we've done. Each of these is just all of the form answers in the order that they came through from the form, with the exception of this little pink box up here, which does that. This is where that bit about Excel formulas earlier comes in. This is called an expression. It's a snippet of code that we're able to use to reference, create a reference number out of earlier bits of the submission date and the number of entries in the table, which is why we read the table first. We could have just added it to the bottom, but because we want to use which number entry this is, we need to read the table to count them first. If we could go back to the slides a second, and if I could stop clicking my mouse. This is a really awkward angle to work the mouse on. Right. This should give us a better look at what that bit of code is doing. So, good God, that's hideous. Let's add some line breaks. It does look very similar to an Excel formula. So if we had some line breaks, I tried so hard to get that animation to work right. It never did. So that looks more like computer code now. So I'm going to add some syntax highlighting to make it a little bit easier to read. So just like with a mathematical formula, computation starts inside the brackets and works out, but trying to read it like that is just going to be unnecessarily confusing. This whole thing, as you can see right at the top, is a concatenate expression, which essentially just means it glues some snippets of text together. We put those snippets of text in the brackets, one on each line here, separated by commas. So 24/7R00, whatever that means, 00, that one. Easy enough. The second part there, that's clearly a date time that we're formatting. So this takes the submission date from the form. That's what the body, square brackets, and question mark are all about. That's reading the body of the response from the form. And then we format that as YY, which means the last two digits of the year, which is just what we wanted the second part of our reference number to be. I know that's not necessarily obvious to intuit from what's written there, but just like writing an Excel formula, there are instructions online for what each of those functions does and what information it expects to be fed. And if you were to Google Powerautomate format date time, you'd get 500,000 results that give you some variation of that line. And I did count, it's 543,000. Now we've worked through that one. Might be possible to take a good guess at that second line. I don't know if there are any takers. Okay, what that does is take the length of the, again, we've got body value, so the output from our get rows action from earlier. Body value is how Powerautomate refers to the contents of the actual output rather than the metadata and stuff about how that action has run. It's worth reiterating, you don't need to worry about constructing any of this from first principles. If you do end up needing to write an expression, if you Google and find something that works, the why can usually be trusted to follow on its own. Putting all that together, if we're adding a 19th result to this table, then the result we'll get from this is, again, I tried my best with the animation, 24 7R00 230019. There might be easier ways to get that, and I couldn't tell you why the HR guy who programmed this decided that was what he wanted to use, but we've got it and it works. There might be easier ways to get it. There are certainly other ways, but we've got this one and it does the trick okay. Clear as mud? Let's go back to flow. So now we've got our reference number there. We're going to send ourselves an approval. This hooks into the approvals app that's on Teams. This will send us a Teams notification asking us to approve all that. All that. There we are. That's just the same details again as we put into the Excel form table even, but this time we're reaching into the Excel row rather than the form entry. Exactly the same information, doesn't matter which one we use. But now the flow is going to pause to wait for a response from somebody in the voice team. So in this example, because I built this one, it's now waiting for me to respond to it. We want it to act differently based on the response once it gets one. So we've got a condition here to branch it out. It'll only do one of these for each time the flow runs. This one works just like the if function in Excel. If the outcome is approve, do this. It's backwards this. If the outcome is reject, do that. The no branch is shortest, so with that one first. For each response we get, just in case multiple people respond at the same time, we're going to record that rejection to the spreadsheet down here. And since we don't want to change any of our other rows, we can leave the rest of them blank. If it's yes, we're going to send emails to the student and the course lead. Those are more or less the same, just phrased slightly differently. So I'm only going to show one. And that's going to summarize the request. You can see I've mixed and matched information from the Excel sheet, the Excel row and the form response. And then we're creating a task in our planner for us to check back in a week to make sure that something has happened. We've got some bits of expression here again. There we go. That one is just UTC now. That does what it says on the tin. That gives us the current time in coordinated universal time. The acronym is wrong because someone had the smart idea of compromising the French when we argued over word order. Don't worry about that. The second one, add days, UTC now 7. I'm sure everybody can figure that out. I have jumped about in my script a little bit. I was meant to come back up here. Bear with me just a second. Okay, yes, we're creating our task to check in on later, adding all the same details in our update details task, just as before. And then we're going all the way back to our Excel row here to, at the end, note that we have sent our 7-day reminder. So that one is a bit more complex, works a little bit of expression-related magic. Okay, this thing spent 12 months being the bane of my existence, but since about New Year, I've had it wrapped around my little finger. I mentioned moving management into the team earlier, and this is one that already existed when I started, just in a much more convoluted form that made it a lot harder to see what was going on when you looked at it, which, when it went wrong, made debugging it an unpleasant experience. So for those of you who might have recruited course reps, you'll know that to register them, you need to put their student number through a form. If we don't get that number, we can't contact them to deliver their training, because we're technically a separate organization, and the quagmire of data protection policies is just not worth the trouble. So we start off with a form response, same as before. I'm not going to open those because they're exactly the same. I do have a different trigger to show you later, and Powerautomate can also do flows that trigger when you tell them to. Like you go onto the website, you press a button, and you can trigger flows by sending an HTTP request to them as well. It's just a web link. And you can have flows trigger each other like that as well. Once you dive into it, there's so much flexibility. But yeah, forms are just really useful. We use them all over the place. So most of our stuff is triggered by a form. This form has two questions, one of which is, are you registering yourself? Which, if the answer is yes, is all we need. And then what's the volunteer's student number if not? I'm going to follow that route because the other one is just a more concise version. And no, scroll across here. Okay. The first thing we need to do is verify the student number is a student number. Older versions of this kept getting usernames, email addresses, full names. Once we even got the title of the course that the rep was volunteering to represent, and no further information. So there was nothing we could do with that. We tried putting input validation on the form to make sure we're at least getting a number, but it turns out that that strips off the leading zeros. So if we had a student number that started with a 0, we'd just get 7 digits instead of 8, and we couldn't just assume that it was the 0 that was missing and not one of the others from somewhere else. So we need to do all of our validation in here instead. So in here, we've got this little bit of expression, there we go, which tries to convert the output from that what's the student number question into an integer, which is just a whole digit. If it fails, which is what that tiny little red line that you can hopefully see under the plus just there means, then what we do is we send an email to the person who filled the form in to say, thank you, but I'm afraid that's not a student number. Could you please try again? And then we're going to stop there. We can't do anything more if we don't have a student number. And if we try, it will just cause a crash and send us error messages. And we don't want that because then we're debugging and nothing has gone wrong. If it is something that we can convert into an integer, then that's good, but we're not out of the woods yet. We need to make sure that it's 8 characters. So we're going to use a similar expression using length there, and you can see just above there, there's one of the notes explaining what that does. Yeah, we're going to use length instead of integer to make sure that the length of that is 8 characters. If that comes out right, then we're in business. If not, we're going to stop and send another error message. But we don't need to do anything more here because now we can continue down here instead. So at 3 a.m. every day, Student and Academic Services push a great big spreadsheet to us. And I mean huge. It's the biggest spreadsheet I've ever seen, containing a full profile export of every student who's opted into SU membership. So that's something like 30 to 40 columns with 180,000 rows. And now we're going to search it. So we've plugged the details of our file in here. In this case, it's a SharePoint location that I don't personally have access to. So I've grabbed those details from our CEO and plugged them in like that. Then the document library, the file, the table, same as before. But then I can put in the name of the column we're looking in here, and then the information we want to use there. Trim is a hangover from an old version that would delete any spaces, but we've already filtered those out by trying to convert it to an integer. So we don't actually need that there anymore. We can just put the outputs in. So we could do that by clicking here, scrolling down, and finding the answer to the question, please enter the student number, and we can put that in like that. And in case you're wondering where the code for that comes from, the body slash and then that string of nonsense, you get the same if you hover over that, which is how you can expose that sort of information. Where am I up to? Okay. Now, you may have noticed, yeah, there we go. This action will pull the first matching row from that spreadsheet. So you may have noticed if there's a student who appears in there twice, meaning they're on 2 courses, this will only return the first one that's detailed. That is something we've now resolved, but that's in our new system that uses Power BI. Far too complex for me to demonstrate now. If you were working with that in Flow, you could fix that with a for each loop, which I'll demonstrate on one of the later ones. At least if I don't run horribly over time, which it's looking like is a possibility. Okay. This next thing here, catch, that's an exception handler, which means if we get a result we didn't expect, that's there to catch the flow if it falls over, so nothing breaks. We've got some, there we go. We've got some run after settings in here, which mean that this section will only run if the previous action fails. And then we've done the same later on to make sure this action only runs if this one is skipped. But in here, we're just doing the same thing we did the previous time we wanted to handle an error. We're sending an email messaging and then stopping so that we don't try and do anything else. Right. This one here pulls the email of the person who responded to the form from Forms and then looks up their Microsoft account. Gives us the same sort of details we'd get from the spreadsheet. It's just a different way of finding them. And then we're going to take all of that information and add it to the list of, as a new entry to the list of reps that we keep on SharePoint. Again, this works the same way as adding someone to a row. Find the SharePoint group, find the list. We've built them a title there with some text and then the response ID from the form. Fill in the information from the spreadsheet that we looked up. All done. As a helpful little confirmation, because we like to know the process completed instead of just getting stuck somewhere, we then send a pretty email here out to whoever it was that filled the form in. We're using HTML here to make it prettier. You can just copy and paste that from Dreamweaver or whatever HTML editor you might use into Flow. The plain text would work fine too, but right around somewhere down here. There we go. Right around here, you can see we're pulling in the given name of the person who submitted the form, just to personalize it a little bit, make it a bit friendlier. There we go. That's the end of that branch. The other one, if the person was registering themselves, just does the same search in the same spreadsheet, just uses the email address of the person who filled out the form and doesn't send a confirmation email because they're about to get one at the end here anyway. So, which means the last thing we do is send a welcome email to the student with a link to our course rep training. That steps things up a little bit from the last one, but hopefully that made some sort of sense to everyone. Yeah. Okay. There are 2 left, and if I can avoid doing that again, this one is a quick one. Let's see how fast we can get through it. So here we're marking answers to a quiz, saving them to our HR department's records, and then sending students a certificate and adding them to a Microsoft team if they passed. Start with a form, same as before. Then we're going to initialize some variables, which are little pockets of information we can refer to later. Think of it like writing a cell and then getting that information back later when you need it. And we're going to use that to contain their score so far and an array, which is basically a list of all the answers we've been given. I could have named these whatever I like. These naming conventions are just because I'm used to using that sort of thing from regular programming. Each of these conditions, 15 of them, all do exactly the same thing. They check the answer that our form received is what we were expecting it to be, to see if it's correct. And then whether it is or not, it adds that response into our array. Done that in text here. So here we're just recording that, yeah, question 1, they didn't get the right answer. If they got the right answer, we are also adding 1 to their score. And we do that 15 times. So then we're grabbing their email address. Sometimes Powerautomate expects multiple results from something, even when you know you're only going to get one. There can only be one person responding to a form at a time, but just in case, Powerautomate decides, well, if you get multiple, I'm going to do the next couple steps for each one. That's fine. We don't need to worry about it. What we're going to do with that is take all their answers, and we're going to add them to our learning management system master database, recording the response ID, going via format number to pad it out to some extra zeros, their student account's email address, the name of the training program is there. There's format date time again, so we've got the date that the form was completed. A more familiar looking if function that matches more closely to the ones in Excel. In that case, if their score is greater than or equal to 11, they've passed. If not, write fail in that box instead. And then we're going to reach into that array that we made earlier and, in order, pull out each of the items from it, which is what the 0 in those square brackets means, because 0 is the first number in programming rather than 1. Don't question it. It is not worth the time. It's just one of the things that we have to accept when we're starting to do programming, and it annoys everybody. So if they have reached the pass mark, if they haven't, we'll just send them an email to tell them. But if they have, we want to take the certificate template that we already have on file. Now open that. That's the same, pulling a file out of SharePoint, the same as we've done before. We're going to create a new Word document. Oh no, please excuse me. There we are. We're going to populate this form from SharePoint first, plugging in title, date completed from the form, and here their given name, surname, in uppercase by virtue of the toUpper function. Create a new file, convert that build in certificate to a PDF, delete the original Word document, and then send them an email with that PDF attached. All of these actions look the same as any of the other actions we've gone through so far. They tell you what input you want, you put it in. And then we're going to add them to our team on RepHub, which is a Teams group we use so all of our reps can communicate with one another. And then we're pulling their user ID from all the way back up here. There. So I've flown through that one a little bit, and I have skipped all of these conditions in the middle, but I promise you they're all the same. Hopefully that was clear enough. OK, I've got one more to go through, and it's a bit of a bigger one. I don't expect this one to make sense immediately. This is the most complex thing that we've got live so far. This is just as an example of, OK, here's what this thing can do when you really get into it. So this flow exists to support our representative networks, which students can join from our website whenever they like. Our membership system automatically creates mailing lists for groups like that, but that's not always convenient. So we wanted people to be able to contact them through Teams as well, which meant adding everyone to a team and periodically checking for new members in that group so we could add them to that team as well. Our membership can export lists of group members sorted and filtered by joining date, which is really helpful for that, but it only gives us their usernames rather than their full email address, which is less helpful. So instead, we came up with this. This process actually starts elsewhere with configuring our membership system to email us with a table of everyone who's joined one of our target groups within the last 7 days. So long as that email, we open here. There we go. So long as that email comes to studentvoice@stas.ac.uk and comes from reports@ukmsl.com, contains an attachment, and has the phrase student group membership update in the subject line, this flow will notice it, pick it up, and we can set a report then for any group we like, and each of those emails will trigger one of these. We've got some more variables. 2 of these are empty. We just need to set them up at the start. But This one has a bit of expression here. Focus on it. There we are. That takes the text from the email subject and removes the student group membership update part and leaves us with the rest, which, assuming the email subscription was set up following the instructions, will leave the name of the group. The other thing we have to set up in advance is a table of group names and Teams groups, which we keep as a file on SharePoint. Storing that information outside the flow keeps things nice and modular and means that we can add or change Teams groups on the fly without needing to come into flow and change that information. And this action just fetches that file. We then use, there we go. We then use this bit of expression to split the file contents, which we need to translate out of a encoding type base 64 every time we encounter whatever you can see at the end there, decode URI component %0D %0A is. That's something called percent encoding for carriage return line feed, which is typewriter inspired computer speak for there's a new line here. Combined with apply to each, all that means is that we're going to do this next bit in here for every line in that file. First order of business, that. So I've broken a few expressions down now, but this one's a bit bigger and has a lot more brackets. In the interest of, that's the wrong one. First order of business, that. So this one's a bit bigger. A lot bigger than that last one, and has a lot more brackets. In the interest of time, I'll not try to make a working example out of it quite yet, and I'll run through it at the end. If we run out of time, I'll try to share a version of the documentation for this flow with everybody, so it can be shared with the recording if you're interested. This expression takes the line of our table that we're currently working with, splits it up into cells, and then discards everything except the last one. I know because of how I set that file up that the last cell discards the last one. I know the last cell is the group, the Teams group, and the rest is the group name. So if we take all of that, discard the end, also remove the one character used to separate cells, then the rest should be the group name. And that should match the one we saved earlier into string group name right at the start. If it doesn't, we need to check the next row, so we don't need to do anything, and this loop will advance. If we do find something, then we're going to use this bit of expression to save the contents of that last cell into one of the variables we set up earlier, and add another one that acts as a results counter. Because this section is going to loop through every line in our table, regardless of whether it finds something or not, and there's no way of stopping it, we need to know if we end up finding more results than we expect. Once we finish looping through our table, that's the next thing we're going to check. If we don't have one result, if our counter is equal to 1, we're fine. If not, we need to send an error message, but sorry, I've lost my place here. There we are. So to save ourselves some work later, we're also going to figure out what kind of error we're looking at, so we can send a slightly different error message. So if we get less than 1, we're going to send that one. Same as before, send a message, stop the flow. If it's more than 1, send a different one instead. For foolproofing, we are also going to run a check on the result that we saved out in case it's an invite link to the team instead of a group ID. We only need the ID, and the easiest way of getting that is pulling it out of an invite link. But pasting the link is easier, so someone is bound to do that at some point. A link will start with HTTP, so if we find that at the start of our result, we're just going to run it through this. There we go. There's a bit of expression here that snips off the actual link part and leaves just the queries at the end, which, if you look at a complex web address, is where all the question marks and ampersands are. And then it splits that up every time there's an ampersand. We then look through each of those queries, pull out the bit that contains the group ID, and then trim it back down and save it back into the result. And I'll go over, time permitting, that in a bit more detail later. All right, last stretch. emails can have multiple attachments. So Powerautomate always requires an apply to each loop when we start working with them, even if we know we're always going to be working with one, just in case. We're going to read the file from the email and then loop through each line of it, except the first one, which our expression skips because that's the header of the table. We don't need to process that. We will then, using this expression, split that line up and get the 10th column, which I know from the layout of the table that we've been emailed with all the students in, that will contain their username. If we have an empty table and we skip a line, we'll be at the end of the file already. So we need to check this part actually comes back with a result first. If we don't need to do anything else, because if the next part fails, it'll look like an error with looking a user up, when actually that user doesn't exist and we didn't need to look them up. And we don't want to investigate problems that aren't there. Hopefully you'll remember, come on mouse, hopefully you'll remember that action from earlier. But this time, rather than using the email taken from somewhere else, we're reconstructing it. I changed something there and didn't save it. So I'm going to put this bit of expression would be repeated here, but I seem to have deleted it in the process of changing something. But we're taking that and plugging at student.staffs.ac.uk on the end of it, which will reconstruct the email address of the user on that line of the table who has joined our Teams group, our network even. Dashed red lines over there mean if that fails, we're going to send an email to tell us what happened and where. If it did work, close that. If it did work, we're going to loop back in our group ID from earlier into here and add our user to a team. This works a bit differently here, adding a user to a team, because we had an interesting time with this action when we first built all this, and it wouldn't work consistently. Flow is still being developed, and its new features can be a bit buggy sometimes. When we built this 12 months ago, that was the case with this action. So our solution was to try 3 different ways of adding a user to a team, all of which refer to their account in a slightly different way. So using their ID number, using their email, and then there's me reconstructing their email address again, just in case that works. It sounds really stupid to do it like this, but things stopped failing once we added that, and we've yet to receive that email at the end where we throw our hands up in surrender at the end. We do still have a little bit of time. So before I ask if you've got any questions about that, and I imagine there might be, let's break down one of the bigger chunks of expression from up there. Now, I do have some slides for this. Hello, everyone on Teams. There we go. Thank you very much. So there's our expression. Just like before, I'm going to add some line breaks and syntax highlighting to make it a little bit more readable. And this time, there'll be an example of the data we're working with at the bottom of the screen. A few things. We've got a few things here. Replace we've encountered already. Okay, I don't want those. There we are. Right. Replace we've encountered already. I'm going to explain it anyway. Last refers to the last item in a list. Split turns one chunk of text into a list of chunks of text every time it encounters a given character. Substring takes a string of text and 2 numbers, and then takes everything off that isn't between those 2 positions. And sub is just short for subtract. I'll step through now so you can see what I mean. So let's start with replace. Items apply to each row refers to the last item in a list. Split turns each one chunk of text into a list of chunks every time it. I'm reading from the wrong part. Yeah, items apply to each is the row we're currently working with. In that row, we want to split it up every time there's a comma, and then replace the last item with nothing, which stands in here for delete. Substring takes a string and 2 numbers, And we now have the string. Starting at 0, which is the first item, we're going to count along to here. The chunk in gray here is the replace function that we just worked through to get the string we're working with. So we're starting at the length of that and then subtracting 1. Run substring on all of that, and we get disabled students network without a comma at the end. There we have it. Once you start breaking it down and figuring out what each part does, an expression like this isn't so hard to read. The hardest part about this whole thing was figuring out wasn't figuring out the syntax. I just Googled all that. The hard parts were figuring out that to delete part of a string, you need to use either replace or substring, and realizing that if I approach this using just split and first to take the start of the whole chunk that I was working with, it would include everything up to the comma, the first comma even, which would have been so much simpler, but it would choke if the group name had a comma in it. Once I realized that, the whole logic of this whole substring replace last sub concoction was lifted wholesale from one Google search: Powerautomate remove last character from string.